Alright, with the power supply mounted pretty nicely there, we need to actually mount the motherboard. And the tricky part is there's nothing to actually screw it onto, so we're going to have to add some slats. So these are just plywood strips I've cut. They are 35mm like the rest of the frame, and they are just sized to fit. There's nothing particularly special about them just yet. The positioning of these will need to line up with the mounting hole slots for the motherboard. Most motherboards are going to be the same because they conform to the ATX spec. This is a micro ATX board. I/O panel will need to be cut out. Every motherboard comes with an I/O panel unique to the motherboard, but the cutout itself is going to be uniform across every motherboard. So the key is that the motherboard will basically be flush up against the wall here, maybe a few mil in. This will clip into that hole, and the motherboard's going to be tied down to these rails here. The motherboard will be on the PC standoffs. These are number 632 screws, I believe. So we'll need to mount that into the plywood as well. The first thing is to get the location where we want the motherboard in relation to the side of the case, and I think that looks pretty good there. I'm also paying attention to the mounting holes for where these slats are. This is just like routing in part 1. First lower the bit at the start and stop point, route away the bit in between, then adjust the fence. So the next step is we actually have to join this into the frame. You probably could get away with butt joining. It's not a very heavy load that's going to be on it. And you do have some side grain on the plywood, going to side grain on the plywood on the other side. A biscuit in this case actually would reinforce it. I don't have a biscuit jointer, so that's out of the question. You could absolutely use the same mortising technique we did for the fans. I'm not going to show that again because at this stage that gets a bit boring. If you have a Dowling jig or accurate enough with your drilling, you could absolutely use dowels. They are probably the best way to do it, but I'm awful with drilling straight holes and I don't have a Dowling jig, so instead I'm going to use a domino. At this point it's not really a requirement, it's quicker for me to do that, which means that I can get on with the rest of the project and produce the video in a timely fashion. Alright, so motherboard in on the support rails. We've got the hole cut out for the I/O plate, but we actually need to mount the motherboard to the plywood. The easiest way to do that is going to be using the standard PC standoffs. And it's easy because they're the right size for the holes, though you could use any spaces you like. They're cheap. And they're cheap. I don't really know where I'm going with it. I've found that these will thread into plywood very well. We just need to pre-drill a 3mm hole. Then we can use a standard thumb screw, PC standard thumb screw, to actually cut the threads in the plywood. Then the brass standoffs will work just fine. So I've got this laid down and I'm going to mark with a brad point bit where to actually drill, and then we can get to installing all of the brass standoffs and mount the motherboard. So this is the front panel. It's relatively unscathed at this stage compared to the other four. We need to put a power button in, otherwise it's going to be a little bit difficult to turn on the computer. I'm going to go with this barrel style momentary switch. You can buy these from eBay, Amazon, electronic stores, wherever. It's not that difficult to find. This particular one is a 19mm diameter barrel on it. So it's actually 18.8, so a 19mm drill bit will work just fine. There's a flange on the outside that is 22mm, so as long as we're smaller than that, it won't poke through. And on the back side there is a hex nut, very small one, that just tightens it down. So we need to drill a recessed hole for the nut. I'm going to go with a 35mm bit so that I can actually get my fingers in, even though point to point it's only 25mm. And then we can drill a through hole for the main barrel, which will be 19mm, and that'll hopefully work. If you like the sort of things I do here and are able to, consider chipping in a few bucks on Patreon. If not, no problem. These videos will always remain free to watch. Unfortunately, glue up didn't go as well as I'd like. The first panel I glued up in part 1 didn't use my clamping jig. Unfortunately, that meant that a couple of the laminations weren't perfect, which resulted in the square frame not being as square as I'd like. Some extra brute force was called for. Using the miter gauge at the table saw, I cut away the corners. Originally this was to start a round over, but I like the look. To accept the panels on the sides, I used a rabbiting bit with a bearing to cut the rabbet. Then I could cut the panels down to size and shape at the sander. I've got two panels, one is glossy acrylic and the other is black painted MDF for a matte look. Both were 3mm. Let me know what I'm doing wrong with the acrylic cutting here. It always wanted to ride up the blade. Do I need the blade up higher? To give the case some elevation, I made some feet for it. The feet were attached using dowels, but unfortunately I had some corrupt footage and couldn't show that part. For a finish, I went for a simple tung oil. To secure the panels, I put down some tape so I could measure it for 2 brass screws per corner, a pilot hole, then countersink bit, then finally screwing in by hand. So the plywood computer is done. I'm quite happy with how it's come out. There are quite a few things I'd do differently next time around, but overall the look is pretty good and it works just fine. Temperatures are about 45 degrees to 50 degrees max. And this is quite old hardware. It's 2008 era CPU, I think. So if you put more modern hardware in, it would probably run even better. I'd be really interested to do a modern high-end gaming computer build in a wooden case. Unfortunately, the reason why I'm using 2008 era hardware is I don't have the money for that, so that'll do just fine. This will be the workshop computer, specifically to run the X-Carve. My laptop's getting a bit old, it's a 2007 era laptop, but that's just fine. For what I want it to do, it'll work just fine. Next time around, I think I would maybe involve some aluminium, certainly some metal on the back panel for mounting the motherboard, so that all the I/O panel stuff works just fine. But otherwise, I'm pretty happy with how it's turned out. Thanks for watching.